Welcome everyone to tonight's Campfire and Candlelight story. In this original scary camping story, we head into the Appalachian foothills with a young couple looking to escape the city for an adventure. But the Appalachians are full of mystery, and as they'll soon learn, a light in the forest won't always guide the way. It might just be the last thing you see before the darkness consumes you. If you enjoy the story, we ask you leave a like to let us know. And if you want to hear more scary camping and hiking stories on the channel, let us know in the comments below. And now, without further delay, we begin our tale. The trailhead was a sliver of gravel carved into the dense green wall of the Appalachian foothills. A faded wooden sign, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, declared Whispering Ridge Trail. Sarah, her backpack cinched tight, grinned at Ben, a spark of pure excitement in her eyes. Ready for an adventure? Ben, his own pack looking a little too new and pristine, offered a hesitant smile. As ready as I'll ever be, I guess. He scanned the thick canopy of trees, their leaves a dark green in the late afternoon light. The air carried the scent of damp earth and pine, a smell that usually soothed him, but today it felt heavy. Sarah, a seasoned hiker, had been talking about this trip for weeks, painting vivid pictures of secluded waterfalls and panoramic mountain views. Ben, a city dweller at heart, had agreed to this hike in the Appalachians mostly to please her. He loved Sarah, her adventurous spirit, her boundless energy. But the sheer isolation of this place, the way the ancient trees seemed to lean in, watching, made him uneasy. "Don't worry," Sarah said, misinterpreting his silence. "It'll be beautiful. Just wait until you see the sunset from the ridge." She pointed towards the trail, which disappeared into the shadowy depths of the forest. "We should make camp before it gets too dark." They started down the trail, the crunch of their boots on the gravel the only sound in the stillness. The trees closed around them, forming a green tunnel, the sunlight filtering through in dappled patches. The air grew cooler, the shadows deeper. Ben felt a prickle of anxiety, a sense of being watched, but he kept his unease to himself. He knew better than to spoil Sarah's excitement. The ridge was further than they thought, so they found a nice bit of clearing to rest for the night. The ground was relatively flat, and a small, trickling stream provided a source of water. Sarah set about pitching their tent with practiced ease, while Ben gathered firewood, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding trees. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, they lit a campfire. The flames crackled and danced, casting flickering shadows that danced among the trees. Sarah leaned back against a fallen log, a contented sigh escaping her lips. "Perfect," she murmured. Ben, though still a little tense, couldn't deny the beauty of the moment. The firelight warmed his face, the sound of the stream was soothing, and the vast, star-studded sky was breathtaking. They shared stories, their laughter echoing through the silent forest, creating a fragile bubble of normalcy in the growing darkness. But as the night deepened and the fire began to die down, a strange silence settled over the clearing. That's when Ben noticed the lights. Ben, his gaze drawn to the edge of the woods, noticed a faint, flickering light moving through the trees. At first, he thought it was a firefly, a solitary beacon in the darkness. But then he saw another light, and another, all moving in a slow, deliberate pattern, as if following their own movements. He watched, his heart beating slightly faster, as the light snaked through the trees, growing closer, their intensity increasing. He tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but the light seemed to be drawing closer, their movements deliberate, almost predatory. He wanted to say something to Sarah, to warn her, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't want to alarm her, to spoil the magic of the moment. Besides, maybe he was just imagining things, seeing patterns where there were none. The lights continued their slow, deliberate paths, their intensity growing, until they seemed to be closing in on their campsite. Ben's heart was now pounding in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. He knew he couldn't ignore them any longer. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "I think we should pack up and move." Sarah turned to him, her eyes wide with surprise. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," Ben stammered, pointing towards the trees. "There are lights out there, moving lights." Sarah looked in the direction he was pointing, but she couldn't see anything. "Lights? Ben, I don't see anything." "I know," Ben said, his voice trembling slightly, "but they were there. I could see them." "So what do you think you saw?" Sarah asked. "I don't know, but I think there was someone out there walking around," Ben said, "circling us." Sarah looked at Ben with concern in her eyes. "Maybe it was just other hikers seeing our fire and making sure they didn't intrude," she said. "Maybe," Ben replied. They both stopped talking. The forest held its breath, as if waiting. Ben, his nerves still on edge, continued to scan the darkness, but there was nothing. No lights, only the rustling of the wind through the trees. Sarah, though initially skeptical, couldn't deny the change in Ben. The fear in his eyes was real. Maybe it was just some animals with reflective eyes, she offered, trying to sound reassuring, even though she wasn't entirely convinced herself. Ben shook his head slowly. "I don't think so. They moved deliberately, like they were watching us." Despite the lingering unease, exhaustion began to take over. The day's hike, coupled with the strange encounter, had drained them both. Let's try to get some sleep," Sarah said finally, her voice weary. "Maybe it'll all make sense in the morning." They put out their campfire, leaving only a few embers glowing faintly in the darkness, and crawled into their tent. The fabric walls offered little comfort against the vastness of the forest outside. Ben lay awake for a long time, his ears straining for any sound, his eyes fixed on the tent's dark ceiling. But the silence held, and eventually, exhaustion pulled him into a fitful sleep. The next morning dawned clear and bright. The forest, bathed in the golden light of the rising sun, seemed to have shed its ominous cloak. The air was crisp and clean, and the birds had returned, their cheerful songs filling the air. Sarah, ever the optimist, seemed to have shaken off the previous night's unease. "See," she said, smiling at Ben, "it was probably nothing, just our imaginations getting the better of us." Ben, though feeling slightly better in the daylight, still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He kept his reservations to himself, not wanting to dampen Sarah's spirits. They ate a quick breakfast, packed up their camp, and continued along the trail. The path wound its way through dense forest, climbing gradually uphill. The trees towered above them, their branches forming a thick canopy that filtered the sunlight, casting the trail in a perpetual twilight. As they hiked, the feeling of being watched returned. Ben couldn't shake the sensation that something was observing them from the shadows, its unseen eyes following their every move. He kept glancing over his shoulder, but there was never anything there. Hours passed, the trail climbing higher and higher. The forest grew older, the trees gnarled and twisted, their branches draped with moss. The air grew colder, and a sense of ancientness settled over the landscape. Then they found it. It was an old shelter, almost swallowed by the forest. It was a simple structure, built of logs and stones. It was weathered but still standing. It looked like it had been abandoned long ago, but was slowly being reclaimed by the relentless embrace of the surrounding landscape. Sarah, ever curious, approached the shelter cautiously. "Wow," she said, her voice hushed. "This place is ancient." Ben hung back. "I don't like it," he said, his voice low. "It looks unsafe." Sarah, ignoring Ben's apprehension, stepped inside. The interior was surprisingly intact, considering its age, but it was dark and dusty, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying wood. A single, small window, choked with vines, offered a meager amount of light, barely illuminating the sparse furnishings. A rickety wooden table stood in the center of the room, coated in a thick layer of dust. 2 overturned stools lay nearby, their legs pointing towards the crumbling ceiling. In one corner, a crude stone hearth hinted at long-dead fires. The walls, made of roughly hewn logs, were covered in strange, faded symbols, carved into the wood with what looked like a rough tool. "Check this out, Ben," Sarah said, running her hands over the carved wood. Ben stood in the doorway and stuck his head inside. The markings were unlike anything Ben had ever seen, a series of lines and circles arranged in patterns by some unknown artist. "Sarah," he said urgently, "we should leave." "Now." "Why?" Sarah asked, looking over at Ben. "Because someone marked this place as theirs and we're intruding," Ben replied. "It's fine," Sarah said. "No one's been here in years." Sarah turned her attention back to the carvings. She ran a gloved hand over the symbols, her brow furrowed in concentration. "What do you think they mean?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. "I don't care what they mean," Ben said, his voice rising in panic. "This place, it feels wrong." As if to punctuate his words, a gust of wind howled through the hole in the roof, sending a cloud of dust swirling through the room. The sound was like a mournful sigh, a whisper from the past. Sarah finally seemed to register Ben's fear. She straightened up, her eyes wide. "Okay," she said, laughing nervously. "Okay, let's go." They hurried out of the shelter, the oppressive atmosphere clinging to them like a shroud. They didn't speak as they continued along the trail, their pace quick and urgent. Ben eager to put distance between them and the abandoned cabin, Sarah to make it to the outlook before nightfall. The forest, though beautiful, now felt menacing. Hours passed, and the trail began to climb steeply. The trees thinned, and the forest floor became rocky and uneven. Finally, they reached the crest of a high ridge. The view was breathtaking. The Appalachian mountains stretched out before them, a vast, undulating sea of green and blue. Ancient forested ridges rolled away to the horizon, their peaks softened by a hazy, distant blue. The trees below were a tapestry of colors, a mix of deep greens, vibrant yellows, and fiery reds, reflecting the start of the changing seasons. The air was thin and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. A hawk circled overhead, its cries echoing through the vastness. Ben, despite his lingering unease, couldn't help but marvel at the panorama. The sheer scale of the landscape, its wild, untamed beauty, was awe-inspiring. It's Incredible, Sarah breathed, her voice filled with wonder. Ben scanned the surrounding forest, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The view, though magnificent, offered little comfort. The vastness of the landscape only amplified their isolation, their vulnerability. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice strained. "But we're still out here, and whatever was in that shelter." He trailed off, unable to articulate the fear that gripped him. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. The shadows lengthened, and the forest below began to darken, its depths becoming more mysterious, more threatening. They found a place to set up their tent. As darkness approached, the feeling of being watched intensified. The wind blew gently through the trees, carrying faint, unsettling sounds. A low moan, a distant snap, the rustling of leaves that seemed too deliberate, too close. And then, just as the last sliver of sun disappeared, Ben saw the lights again. This time, Sarah saw them too. At first, they were faint, flickering points of light, moving among the trees at the edge of their vision. But as darkness deepened, they became clearer, more distinct. They weren't fireflies. They were too bright, too steady. Those are lanterns," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Ben's heart pounded in his chest. "Or flashlights," he added, his voice hushed. The lights moved closer, their movements slow and deliberate. They weren't clustered together, but spread out, as if a group of people were walking through the trees surrounding them. Ben fumbled for his flashlight, his hands shaking. He switched it on and swept the beam across the darkness. The light cut through the trees, revealing only the dense foliage, the gnarled branches. But then, for a brief moment, he caught a glimpse. A silhouette, tall and indistinct, holding a light. And then another, and another. They were there, just beyond the reach of his flashlight's beam, moving silently through the woods. "I can see them, but only their silhouettes," Ben said, a slight tremor in his voice. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. "Who is it?" she whispered. "What do they want?" Ben didn't answer. He just kept darting the beam from his flashlight around. Desperately, Sarah called out. "Hello," she shouted, her voice echoing through the silent forest. "Who are you? What are you doing out there?" The only response was the whisper of the wind through the trees, the rustling of leaves, and the faint, steady glow of the lights moving closer, closer, their silent presence more terrifying than any scream. The silhouettes remained hidden, just beyond the edge of their lights. The silence that followed Sarah's call was deafening, broken only by the frantic beating of their own hearts. The lights continued their slow, relentless approach, their silent advance more terrifying than any confrontation. Sarah, her voice trembling, turned to Ben. "We need to go," she said urgently. "Now." Ben frantically looked around for his backpack. Panic flared as he realized it was gone. "My pack," he said, his voice choked with fear. "It's gone." Sarah's eyes widened. Mine too. They didn't waste another second. They turned and fled, abandoning their campsite, their half-eaten meal, the remnants of their brief moment of peace. They ran back the way they had come, their feet pounding on the uneven ground, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest path was swallowed by darkness, the trees looming like shadowy giants, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The only light came from the faint glow of the lights behind them, moving through the trees with an unsettling persistence. The lights followed them, keeping pace, but never closing in. It was as if they were being herded, guided, towards a destination they didn't know. The darkness was disorienting. They stumbled over roots and rocks, their legs burning, their lungs aching. The trees seemed to close in around them, their shadows twisting and distorting the path. "The shelter," Sarah gasped, her voice ragged. "We need to get back to the shelter." Ben nodded, his chest heaving. The shelter, with its ominous atmosphere, now seemed like a refuge, a place to hide. They ran on, driven by fear and adrenaline, the lights dancing in the darkness behind them, their silent pursuit a constant, terrifying reminder of the unseen presence that stalked them. They finally reached the clearing, where they had found the dilapidated shelter earlier that day. The structure emerged from the dark before them, a shadowy silhouette against the inky blackness. Without a word, they scrambled inside, their hearts pounding in unison, and shut the door behind them. The interior was even darker now, the meager light from the sky swallowed by the dense canopy above. They fumbled for anything they could use to barricade the doorway, the old table and stools, anything to create a barrier against whatever was outside. They heard sounds of movement outside and barely audible whispers. The unsettling noises intensified as they scrambled to block the door. The whispers seemed to grow louder, closer, as if whoever or whatever were making them were now right outside the thin walls. The snapping of branches became more frequent, more violent, and the rustling sounded like something large was moving just inches from the flimsy logs. Ben and Sarah huddled together in the darkness, their fear a tangible thing in the confined space. The lights, which they could now see through the cracks in the walls and the old dirty window, were circling the shelter, their eerie glow flashing as they passed. The cacophony of sounds was overwhelming. The whispers, the snaps, the rustling, all swirling around them, creating a terrifying symphony of unseen menace. It felt as if they were trapped in the eye of a storm they could not escape. They pressed themselves against the far wall of the shelter, as far away from the doorway as possible, their eyes wide with terror. The lights outside seemed to pulse, their eerie glow reflecting in their wide, frightened eyes. The sounds grew louder, closer, as if whatever was out there was finally preparing to breach their flimsy sanctuary. They held their breath, waiting, listening to the terrifying orchestra of the unknown, the darkness pressing in on them from all sides. The noise was reaching a fever pitch, a terrifying crescendo that seemed to vibrate through the very timbers of the old shelter. The whispers clawed at their ears, the snapping of branches sounded like gunshots, and the rustling was a frantic, unseen dance just outside the walls. Ben and Sarah held each other, their bodies trembling, bracing for what might come next. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The whispers vanished. The snapping ceased. The lights dimmed and then disappeared. A stillness descended upon the forest, a silence so absolute it felt unnatural, almost suffocating. The circling lights, which had been their constant, terrifying companion, had winked out, leaving only the impenetrable darkness of the night outside the window of the little cabin. Ben and Sarah held their breath, their ears straining in the sudden quiet. The silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. At least the sounds and lights told them where the danger was. This silence was an unknown, a void filled with a chilling sense of anticipation. It was as if the storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that hinted at a deeper, more sinister presence. They remained huddled together in the darkness, their eyes wide, their hearts still pounding in their chests. The silence stretched on, each passing moment amplifying their fear. The sudden absence of the noises and lights was a new kind of terror, a silence promising something far more unsettling. The forest held its breath, and so did they, trapped in the unnerving stillness, waiting for what would come next. The silence pressed down on them thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket. They dared not move, dared not speak, their ears straining for any sound, their eyes searching the impenetrable darkness for any sign of movement. Hours crawled by, each minute an eternity, their nerves stretched to breaking point. The first faint glimmer of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the shelter's walls, a pale, hesitant light that offered little comfort. The silence remained unbroken, the forest still holding its breath. Finally, as the light grew stronger, revealing the dust-laden interior of the shelter, Sarah spoke, her voice a hoarse whisper. "We need to go," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "Now." Ben nodded, his face pale and drawn. He didn't argue. He didn't even look back at the doorway, only at the forest beyond. They had nothing with them anymore. Survival was now their only priority. They stumbled out of the shelter, their bodies aching. The forest, bathed in the pale light of dawn, seemed to hold its secrets close, its trees standing like silent sentinels. They didn't see anyone, and they didn't see any lights. So they ran. They ran as if their lives depended on it, their feet pounding on the uneven ground, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They didn't stop, didn't look back, their eyes fixed on the trail that led back to the trailhead. The ridge, the shelter, the lights. They left it all behind, a terrifying memory etched into their minds. They didn't care about the beauty of the mountains, the ancient trees, the panoramic views. All they cared about was escape. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, winding through the dense forest, climbing and descending, testing their already exhausted bodies. But they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the trailhead. The gravel parking lot, the faded wooden sign, the road leading back to civilization. It was a beacon of hope, a promise of safety. They didn't slow down until they reached their car, Ben's hands trembling as he fumbled for the keys. Sarah cast one last glance behind them. They climbed inside, locked the doors, and drove away, their eyes fixed on the road ahead. They didn't look back at the ridge. They didn't dare. If you enjoyed that original scary hiking story, why don't you check out this next relaxing bedtime story as well?